mental health research, all the time I've been involved in psychiatry, there's always been a promise that we're right on the edge, that something new is going to happen. I think more times than not, that promise has always come from the direction of genetics. That genetics have progressed to such a level that we're now going to have significant breakthroughs. I think that optimism has to be tempered by the fact that, well, the progress has not been fantastic, and say a number of papers in Science last year were very sobering in terms of what is the likelihood of any significant breakthrough in that domain. I think psychiatry has a big problem. The big problem is to connect itself to a rigorous scientific framework. I think it can do that. That scientific framework is neuroscience. Psychiatry has always been conducted slightly away from neuroscience. I think it is now more important than ever for it to connect to the mainstream. So my view is that the big breakthroughs will come to pass when psychiatry fully embraces neuroscience, and that what will happen there is that there'll be a greater refinement of the categories that we deal with. So for example, mental illness are described with broad categories like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, under the assumption that these descriptive categories reflect underlying biological entities. I think that's probably not the case. I think by using the tools of neuroscience, we can parse up that whole domain of mental illness into something that is much more scientifically plausible, which will lead, in my view, to significant advances. But I think we're not talking about the next 5 years. I think we're talking about a horizon of probably 20 years. I think, for all mental illnesses, there is a biological basis. There's a biological basis for everything to do with cognition. There's a biological basis for your dreams, your fantasies, and if something is an illness, there is a biological correlate there. That's indisputable in my view. So let's take agoraphobia as an example. Agoraphobia is an irrational fear of crowds, open spaces. Does that have a biological basis? Well, I would say yes, it does. When a person experiences this irrational fear, it means something to do with fear processing is being triggered inappropriately and no longer modified by cognition. You might say to somebody who's fearful of open space or crowds that there's nothing to be fearful of. That would normally temper somebody's fear. Somebody with agoraphobia, it doesn't temper. So there's a lack of control of the processes that mediate fear that are triggered by context, and there's no longer any contextual modulation of that process. So in a way, that is a pathology. It's no different than somebody who's got an abnormal tachycardia. Is there something physically abnormal? Well, that depends upon your frame of reference. Is there some physiological abnormality in part of the circuitry in the brain that we know mediates fear? I would say yes, there is, at the time they're experiencing it. It is a process that's normal, we all experience fear, but is being triggered inappropriately and is not susceptible to the modulatory influences or the dampening influences that are normally mediated by cognition. UCL, by common consensus, and not only among those at UCL, but internationally, is extremely strong in neuroscience, arguably one of the strongest in the world, in my view the strongest in the UK. So there's a great strength and depth in neuroscience, covering everything from cellular up to systems neuroscience. So given what I've said, that I think psychiatry has to really embrace neuroscience, UCL is in an extraordinarily powerful position to really contribute significantly to the advancement of a mental health research agenda. what's wrong with UCL? It's always difficult to say something negative about your own institution, but I think one of the things that has to happen is a greater connection between the parts and a greater focusing of the research agenda based around the strengths of the institution. So, for example, to conduct mental health research here requires ultimately access to patients. I don't think that is so easy. So there isn't a framework yet in place which can facilitate that. But what is very striking is that over the last year or two there is a significant push in this direction. I think people realise the potential, and I think there is really great ground for optimism that that deficit is about to be corrected.